I've been hiking the Appalachian Trail for the better part of 30 years now. I've had plenty of hair-raising run-ins that I don't care to repeat. I've come face to face with black bears and their cubs, which, as any experienced hiker will tell you, is about as close to staring death in the face as you can get. I've had fishers running up trees next to my tent at night, which was very unsettling, especially back when I was young and stories of skinwalkers still gave me the chills. And there was one time I heard such a sickening crack of wood when crossing a log bridge over a rushing river that I was convinced I was going to drown. But let me tell you, there ain't no kind of fear like the fear your fellow man can give you. The Appalachians have a way of getting into people's heads, and it can be just as negative as it can be positive. I can tell you firsthand that once you get a taste for hiking, you really enjoy it. There's nothing quite like being up there, far away from civilization, relying on nothing but your wits and whatever you can carry on your back. The Appalachians change people. You might have heard about the old tradition of taking a trail name, something like Bear or Sovereign, as a way of expressing how you've left your old self back down in the lowlands. It's not just for aesthetic purposes either. Every time you go out into the wilderness, a little bit of the wilderness goes into you too. For some folks, especially city folks, that can be a good thing. It opens the mind and helps them appreciate the simple things, like a warm, soft bed or a good shower. But for other folks, the Appalachians get into them in a way that a demon might possess someone's soul. It burns them up inside, burns everything good out of them, until all that's left ain't fit to be called human. I've heard stories of people taking their own lives after hikes when they've walked the whole trail over the course of a summer or fall, then just been unable to go back to their drab, tedious lives back in their concrete jungles. I've heard plenty of other stories about folks who lose their minds up in those hills, running into a group of less experienced hikers and just killing them. I've never encountered anyone like that myself, but I believe I almost did, and that's about as far as I ever want to get to one of them. This was way back in the late 90s when I was doing some solo hiking up in the Great Smoky Mountains. I was experienced enough not to have to stick to the trails, but not experienced enough to know that it's better to wait out approaching bad weather than to try and beat the skies. I thought taking a more direct route over the hills and through the forest would mean I could get a hot shower and hot chow quicker. But as it turned out, my arrogance meant I was caught in a hellish downpour. Experienced hikers will tell you that a hot sun might burn and blister your skin, but wet feet can kill you. Wet feet mean foot rot and fungus, and when you're relying on them to get you to food and shelter and away from any potential dangers, not being able to rely on your feet can be a death sentence. I knew enough to know that, so when the heavens suddenly opened, I went running off to find myself some cover. In the end, I found it in the form of what I thought was a shallow cave set into a rock face. At the time, I thought it was an actual godsend and said a little prayer of thanks as I took off my wet clothes and swapped them for dry ones. I was so relieved to be out of the rain that I didn't actually check out how deep the cave went. Not until I was dry again and getting bored from having to take shelter for so long. I took my flashlight out from my pack, switched it on, and then saw that the cave went way further back than the creeping daylight let on. Not only that, but it narrowed off into a much smaller passageway that I'd have to get on my hands and knees to traverse. Now, I know what you're thinking. Who in their right mind would want to crawl down a narrow cave tunnel in the middle of the woods when they could just stay warm, dry, and safe in the cave's opening? But then I imagine there are some of you that have gathered that I have something of an adventurous streak. And after about an hour of just sitting there waiting for the rain to pass, I was going crazy with boredom. So, if there was something that could help me kill some time before I got back on the move, you bet your butt I was going to do it. That's how I ended up creeping towards the opening to the tunnel with a flashlight ready. I never would have guessed in a million years what I was about to see. I figured I might see some of those awesome pointy, hangy things, stalactites or whatever they're called, but the first thing I saw when I poked my head through the other side made me immediately stop in my tracks. It was a single rock chamber, and the first thing that made me think, hold up, was signs of human habitation. There was quite clearly some kind of bedroll in there, incredibly filthy, but there it was. Then, just as I was thinking how someone must have been all kinds of smart and resourceful to use this place as shelter, I saw what was on the walls. Whoever had been sleeping there had scratched so many letters and words into the stone that there wasn't a single inch of rock left unscathed. I spent so long trying to read all that chicken scratch that I didn't see the skulls lining the bottom of the cave walls. So many I couldn't even count, and they looked like they were from every kind of animal that called Appalachia home. I was understandably nervous after seeing all that, but my blood didn't run cold until I saw the skull that quite obviously belonged to a human being. I don't know how a person could get their hands on a human skull. There are so many old burial sites around these parts that it's not out of the question that they just maybe found one. But as we all know, that's not the only way a person can get their hands on a human skull. And I definitely didn't want mine to be the next skull lining that wall of that chamber. After that, I wasn't too keen on hanging around as I had been previously. Although it was still raining like the dickens out there, I decided it was better to take my chances getting soaked than to hang around and wait for whoever lived there to come back. They didn't seem like the kind of person that would appreciate the sudden appearance of a stranger. And from the way that bedroll looked, they'd been sleeping there recently, too. I've been up to those parts of the Smokies since, but I've stuck to the trails. And anyone I bump into in that area, I always tell them to be wary of strangers, even folks who seem kind-hearted and friendly, such as myself. Because, like I said, the hills get into people's heads in a way that changes them, not for the better, but for the worse. If you're enjoying the video, please subscribe the channel for future videos, and like and share with your friends. Hey there, I'm a huge camping and hiking enthusiast, so one of the holy grails of my hobby has always been the Appalachian Trail. Unfortunately, I've never had the time to hike the whole thing. So, throughout the years, my friends and I visited certain sections of the trail for about a week at a time. We were based in New Jersey, so we crossed Mount Miney off our list pretty early. The next year, we tackled the part of the trail near Anthony's Nose, leading up to Camp Smith. The year after that, we conquered the 100-mile wilderness in Maine. But in 2018, we decided to venture a little further south. We'd heard a lot of good things about the George Washington and Jefferson National Parks. They're some of the wildest sections of the trail, and the parks are home to some really cool features like the oldest fire lookout tower in the eastern U.S. But the place I had my heart set on visiting was an old ghost town called Lignite. I'm really into ruins and abandoned places, and I think I'd be more into urban exploration if your videos on the subject didn't put me off the idea entirely. See, the idea of getting to see an old ruined town like that was really appealing to me. In reality, though, venturing out near Lignite was probably one of the worst mistakes we'd ever made while on a hiking trip. It's honestly kind of a miracle that none of us were seriously hurt. So, to cut to the chase, we started out near Covington, then hiked our way down into the forest until we hit the trail. After that, we followed it about 20 miles up these winding trails until we found Lignite. The whole hike took us about 9 hours, so as you can imagine, we were pretty exhausted by the time we arrived at the old ghost town. Instead of moving off to find a more covered campsite for the night, we decided to just bed down near the ruins so we could explore them in the morning. There wasn't all that much to see, to be perfectly honest, just some old foundations and a few crumbling chimney stacks. But it was still worth taking a few pictures before we moved on down the trail. The next morning, we got up, and before we packed our stuff away, my buddy Joey and I decided to take a little stroll among the ruins. We were just meandering along, still kind of half asleep from the grueling hike the day before. Joey was taking the lead while I followed, snapping pictures with my phone. Then suddenly, my eyes were drawn to something that Joey seemed to be walking towards, completely unaware. I found myself reaching out to grab the back of his shirt, tugging him back to stop him from walking any further. Right there, among the half-dead yellow grass, was an old rusted bear trap. At first, we were kind of amazed at what we were looking at. The thing looked like it could have been an antique, like it had been there for 100 years, just rusting away in the wilderness. Joey then joked that I'd basically saved him from nothing and that he'd have been kind of impressed if the thing had actually clamped itself around his leg if he'd stood on it. We made a little bet over whether or not it was still functioning. Before we knew it, we were picking up rocks and bits of old brick to toss at the small round trigger in the middle. Took us a few tries, but in the end, Joey managed to hit the trigger mechanism with a chunk of old masonry. Snap! We found ourselves recoiling in horror as the thing violently snapped shut. We both shared this nervous kind of laughter because it could have just as easily been Joey's leg trapped in that thing if he'd stood on it. Although we were laughing, we were definitely pretty freaked out. It was only when we realized that there might actually be more of them in the area that we got serious about it as a threat. Dealing with one was one thing, but a threat unknown was another thing entirely. We then very carefully made our way back to where we were camped, told the other guys about the bear trap, and suggested that we move someplace else since there might have been more of them out there in the grass or something. Skylar didn't believe us at first. He thought we were playing a prank on him, but he only realized we were serious when I showed him the picture on my phone of the bear trap all closed up. After that, we packed up our stuff and very carefully hiked out of the area, making sure to keep our eyes on the ground in front of us the whole way. We ended up walking about 5 miles west towards a place called Barber's Creek, hoping it would provide us with a much safer campsite, as well as a source of fresh, clean water. It definitely provided us with one of those things, as there were a few fast-flowing parts of the river that allowed us to fill up our water bottles. Although it seemed fine and deserted to us at first, we found something the next morning that proved otherwise. One of our usual routines when deciding where to camp was to mark out an area for us to use as a bathroom. I won't gross you out with all the gory details of digging holes and whatnot, but it was a kind of silent agreement to confine all our groupies, as Johnny Depp so elegantly phrased it, to a certain area away from the campground to remain as hygienic as possible. Once the sun had set, we made ourselves some hot food over a fire, shared some bourbon that Mike had brought along, and got ourselves some much-needed rest. We didn't hear anything moving around in the darkness, no voices or sounds of metal or anything. The whole night was perfectly quiet and still, apart from a few crickets and cicadas. That's when we found it extra creepy. The next morning, Mike got up and wandered off to the bathroom area, then started calling out to us through the trees. I remember waking up with a startle at the sound of his voice, not knowing what the deal was, but hearing enough fear in his cry of "You better come see this," to know that something was definitely wrong. I pulled on my shorts and boots, then joined the other 2 guys in rushing through the woods in the direction of Mike's voice. But as soon as he came into view, he turned to us and started shouting, "No, no, no!" with a look of absolute terror on his face. We all froze, thinking he might be facing down a black bear or something. But the whole woods in front of him were completely clear. That's when he pointed down at the ground in front of him, saying something like, "This wasn't here yesterday, was it?" He was pointing at another rusty old bear trap. And no, it was most definitely not there the day before. It was lying right where we'd all been walking to and from the little bathroom area we designated, right out in the open. We all agreed that whoever had put it there was banking on one of us stepping on it during a nocturnal bathroom break. We had to repeat the process of being extremely careful where we stood as we trudged back towards our campground and packed our stuff. We applied the same amount of care to where we stepped when making our way south away from Barber's Creek and towards a small town called Newcastle. We were in no mood to stay out on the trail, not after it had become painfully obvious that whoever had laid the bear trap had followed us all the way from Lignite down to Barber's Creek. It was also a deeply unsettling realization that the bear trap we found at Lignite probably wasn't there by accident either. Given its condition, we figured it had been set years before our arrival. But by then, it seemed much more likely that it had been set as we slept. Once we got to Newcastle, I made sure to call our find into the local cops. Just about anyone could have accidentally walked out onto that bear trap, and God forbid if they were alone and lacking cell reception. But then the question about who might have placed the traps came up, and neither we nor the cops had any clue who might have actually done something like that. In fact, they found it pretty weird that someone wouldn't cover the thing up with leaves or make any other kind of attempt to hide it. It was like whoever had laid it there wanted us to find it, like it was more about sending a message than actually trying to maim one of us. We ended up catching a bus over to Petersburg to completely throw whoever it was off our trail. There was a period where Mike didn't want us to carry on at all. He was that freaked out by the idea of someone following us totally unseen, and not only that, but they were able to somehow lay a bear trap without making any noise, which we all found intensely creepy, especially at night. Thankfully, no one followed us for the rest of the trip, not to our knowledge anyway, and there were no more bear trap finds near any of the other campsites. But that didn't mean we didn't have some seriously sleepless nights for a few days. The first night we got back out on the trail, we all spent it sitting around a dead fire, shining our flashlights out into the darkness, just scanning the woods for any signs of anyone creeping around. It was only when we were 100% sure that we weren't in any more real danger that we were able to get any decent sleep. But I think by that point, Whoever had been laying the traps was confident that we'd gotten the message to leave and to never come trespassing around Lignite again. You know, serial killers aren't unique to America, but they sure have captured the national imagination. American cinema loves to dive into the dark world of these twisted individuals, both real and fictional. Think Ted Bundy, John Wayne Gacy, Jeffrey Dahmer. Most of America's most infamous serial killers operated during what we might call the golden age of serial murder, from the early 70s to the late 80s. But what about the first serial killers in the United States? To answer that, we have to go way back to the 13 colonies, a time when violence and political strife were part of daily life. This is the story of America's first brutal and bloodthirsty serial killers, the Harpy brothers. Not much is known about the early years of Micah and Wiley Harpy. They were born in 1748 and 1750, respectively. Their parents were Scottish immigrants who moved to America in either 1759 or 1760. The Harpy family settled in Orange County, North Carolina, between 1761 and 1763. Like many Scottish settlers, they were staunch Calvinist Protestants and fiercely loyal to the British Crown, earning them the nickname Tories. These folks often joined loyalist militias that put down rebellions against the Crown. Ironically, when the Revolutionary War broke out, the Harpy brothers tried to enlist with the American forces. But due to their families' past associations with Tory militias, they were refused entry and suspected of being spies. Some historians speculate that this rejection fueled their resentment, but it's more likely they were just looking for an opportunity to wreak havoc. During the war, the Harpy brothers joined a group of loyalist criminals who took advantage of the chaos. They violated women, stole, murdered, and destroyed property, especially targeting farms of those who supported the revolution. These gangs were as brutal and violent as you can imagine. The Harpy brothers were right in the middle of it, taking part in battles like Kings Mountain in October 1780 and Blackstocks in November 1780. But their efforts did nothing to slow the progress of the revolution. After the decisive British defeat at Yorktown in 1781, the Harpy brothers fled North Carolina to seek refuge with the renegade Cherokee tribe in the Appalachian Mountains. From their mountain sanctuary, the Harpy brothers began a series of revenge raids against the newly liberated Americans. Their first major attack was alongside 400 Cherokee tribesmen on present-day Nashville, Tennessee. The following year, they gave Daniel Boone's frontier army a bloody nose at the Battle of Blue Licks in Kentucky. They retreated to the Native American village of Nickajack, but Boone and his forces soon closed in. In retaliation for their defeat at Blue Licks, Boone's men burned Nickajack to the ground. The Harpy brothers, still considered loyalists by the revolutionary forces, were forced to hide out in the forests of Powell Valley near Knoxville, stealing supplies from local pioneers just to survive. During this time, the brothers stewed in bitterness. They were almost completely outcast from civilized society. They hated the fact that they had lost their way, they hated the neighboring townsfolk, and they hated the very country they resided in. Instead of giving up, they embarked on one of the first campaigns of serial murder in American history. In 1797, they murdered a man named Johnson for no other reason than crossing paths with him while he was out hunting. They mutilated his body, filled his chest with rocks and stones, and urinated on him. When his body was discovered, a massive effort was launched to find the culprits, forcing the Harpy brothers to flee north into neighboring Kentucky. They entered the state via the Wilderness Road near Cumberland Gap. On their travels, they came across a traveling salesman named Pton. Pton offered to sell the Harpy brothers some of his goods, but upon hearing him talk glowingly about the newly founded republic, Micah Harpy flew into a rage and beat the man to death. They repeated the act of disemboweling and urinating on the body, then made off with the dead man's horse and some of his goods. Next, the brothers targeted 2 travelers from Maryland, torturing, murdering, and mutilating them after overhearing them express animosity towards the British. It's believed that the younger Harpy brother, Wiley, held one of the travelers down and forced him to watch the torture and murder of his longtime companion. Once again, both victims' chest cavities were filled with stones and rocks as a final show of gruesome disrespect. After the Harpy brothers murdered a Virginia man named John Langford, they were apprehended by a local militia force and imprisoned at the Kentucky State Prison in Danville. But they managed to escape by luring one of their guards into their cell, pretending to be horribly unwell. They strangled him with their own shackles, took his key, and fled into the surrounding wilderness. When the alarm was raised, a posse of jailers and militiamen were sent after them. Somehow, the Harpy brothers found out the identities of the men in the posse and, as revenge, snuck into a nearby town at night, hunted down one of the men's families, and slaughtered his young son. Following this horrific atrocity, Kentucky Governor James Garrard announced a $300 bounty on the Harpy brothers on April 22, 1799. Garrard hoped the bounty would pacify the brothers, either driving them out of state or forcing them to lay low. Instead, it only made them more vicious. The brothers became intensely paranoid, often mistaking innocent travelers for bounty hunters. Over the following days, the Harpy brothers killed 5 different people in 2 separate instances simply because they had been spotted and feared being further pursued. After fleeing into Illinois, the brothers made their way to a natural cave system on the bluffs above the Ohio River, only to discover it was the stronghold of a band of river pirates led by the infamous Samuel Mason. Mason welcomed the pair of outlaws, especially since they only asked to be sheltered from the law and would aid the gang in their raids in exchange for food, water, and a place to sleep. Mason believed the brothers would be a boon to the gang, but he soon realized they were a burden, and a shockingly evil one at that. The Mason gang generally killed only when necessary and only for monetary gain. But the Harpy brothers seemed to mutilate and kill just for the fun of it. At one point, the brothers led away one of the gang's hostages, with Mason believing they were taking the man back to their hideout to be kept prisoner. Moments later, the gang watched in horror as the Harpy brothers appeared on a cliff above them and shoved their now-naked prisoner down onto the rocks below, laughing as he screamed for mercy. Their insatiable lust for blood and terror was so extreme that even a hardened outlaw like Samuel Mason had to force the brothers to leave at gunpoint. He wanted no part of the sick depravity they partook in, knowing it would surely draw the law's attention. Furious at the rejection, but aware there was no arguing with the business end of a rifle, the Harpy brothers simply moved back into eastern Tennessee to continue their killing spree. In July 1798, records show that a farmer named Bradbury, a man named Hardin, and a boy named Coffee were all murdered by the Harpy brothers. Although there are no records indicating exactly why they were killed, as there were no witnesses, we can speculate that the farmer was killed so the brothers could help themselves to his crops without having their movements reported to the authorities. But why on earth they would want to kill a young boy is simply beyond all reasonable explanation, providing nothing but an insight into how murderously depraved they truly were. The brothers left a trail of death wherever they went, making it remarkably easy for authorities to track them. They were traced to the banks of the Holston River, where a man named William Ballard was found disemboweled, packed with rocks, and tossed into the water so the fish could gnaw on his rotting flesh. They were then traced to a place known as Brassel Knob, where the body of a man named James was discovered with his home ransacked and his throat slashed. To evade authorities, the brothers crossed state lines into south-central Kentucky, where the discovery of 2 bodies bore all the hallmarks of their grisly handiwork. John Graves and his teenage son were found dead near Logan County with extensive mutilation to their skulls, most likely caused by the axes they were using to chop wood. Like so many others, they had been disemboweled, packed with rocks and stones, and urinated on. Just a few nights later, the brothers came across an entire family sleeping in a camp not far off the trail. If we are to believe their signature was disembowelment, this family of 5 also fell victim to their bloodlust. Once again, they needlessly slaughtered an innocent child who would have posed absolutely no threat to them whatsoever. This is one of the few crimes that the Harpy brothers ever expressed any real remorse over. Wiley Harpy confessed that he bashed in the infant girl's head against a tree because her wails of terror irritated him. The brothers' killing spree continued all throughout the summer of 1799. But the more lives they stole, the bigger the pursuing posse grew. It swelled with the family members of those they'd slaughtered, men who sought to wreak terrible revenge on the 2 monsters who had taken away their loved ones. By the end of the summer, the posse was said to number almost 100 men, who were then able to split up into mounted, fast-moving teams of hunters. They eventually succeeded in tracking and cornering the brothers in Coeys Muhlenberg County. The brothers were preparing to ambush a settler named George Smith when suddenly a voice called out through the woods, ordering them to surrender. Terrified, the brothers attempted to flee, but a member of the posse fired a well-aimed shot, striking Micah Harpy in the leg. Wiley Harpy managed to quickly mount his horse and escape, but the same could not be said for the wounded Micah. As he lay bleeding among the pines, the posse forced him to confess to up to 20 different murders. When he was finished, a man named Moses Stahl, a grieving relative of a family the brothers had killed, stepped forward and produced a large Bowie knife from his belt. While Micah was still conscious, Moses plunged the knife into Micah's throat, slicing and cutting until he was able to twist the outlaw's blood-soaked head from the stump of his neck. Moses then placed the bloody head in a burlap sack and rode all the way back to Webster County, Kentucky, where the family's homestead was built. He nailed the head to a tree outside the house. To this day, the crossroads near which Micah's head was mounted is known as Harp's Head Road, in honor of the revenge that was reaped that fateful day. Not long after the death of his brother, Wiley Harpy managed to talk his way back into the Mason gang and evaded the same fate as Micah for 4 long years. But eventually, Wiley's luck ran out, and he was captured along with the rest of the Mason gang when the law finally caught up with them in 1804. Wiley was executed via hanging in modern-day Jefferson County, Mississippi, and like his brother, his head was staked high along the Natchez Trace as a warning to other outlaws. The Harpy brothers' killing spree lasted almost 3 decades and claimed the lives of up to 50 innocent men, women, and children. Their terrifying story sank deep into American folklore, and although there are numerous references to them in art and literature throughout the 20th century, theirs is a story that is painfully undertold in our day and age. They are arguably America's first real serial killers, having established a specific modus operandi that made their murders as distinguishable as they were dastardly. Their story will remain as compelling as it is chilling for as long as it's told. In the late spring of 1986, Virginia Tech Business Administration master student Becca White sat down for breakfast one morning in the university's cafeteria. She was a hard-working and diligent young student, but her industriousness had left her isolated and pining for the company of another. So, you can only imagine her joy when Manhattan-born architecture student Claudia Brenner sidled up next to her and asked, "Is this seat taken?" What followed was the love affair of a lifetime. As each woman discovered the intimate preferences of their opposite number, they realized they were perfect for each other. They had a great deal in common, both being highly intelligent, goal-oriented young women with a deep appreciation for the outdoors. Over the next 2 years, as they fell deeply in love with one another, they made frequent trips to some of the most beautiful scenic hiking trails the Appalachians had to offer. So, it came to pass that in May of 1988, Claudia and Becca decided to visit the Michaud State Forest in Pennsylvania, an 85,000-acre expanse of woodland that is home to a section of the Appalachian Trail. They drove up from Virginia Tech, singing along to the radio the whole way, sharing road snacks, and planning out their latest outdoor adventure. Eventually, they found what they agreed was a suitable place to park their car before gathering up their things and heading off into the trees. But the place they parked had a name that, in light of the fate they shared, has a chilling sense of foreboding to it. The place they parked before heading off into the Michaud State Forest was one named Dead Woman's Hollow. About an hour into the walk down the Appalachian Trail, the couple came across the first of a series of campgrounds known as primitive campsites. There are around 7 or 8 of those campsites dotting the southern slopes of the Appalachian Hills. Claudia and Becca navigated the trail until they found the perfect site for them to pitch their tent. Once they established their cozy campsite, Becca White excused herself to the campground's bathrooms for a moment. But as she walked, she was suddenly startled by the presence of a young man who seemed to be lurking near the small wooden facility building. It wasn't just his sudden and unexpected presence that startled her. It was the young man's frightening appearance that really gave her the creeps. The young man's hair was wild and unkempt, and his shockingly gaunt facial features made it look like he hadn't eaten a decent meal in weeks. His clothes were filthy and torn, and the amount of dirt under his fingernails suggested that bathing wasn't exactly his strong suit. The man grinned at Becca and asked if she had a spare cigarette. She told him that she didn't smoke and politely excused herself before walking back towards the campsite. Becca immediately told Claudia that they weren't nearly as alone as they'd first expected, and that the encounter with the leering stranger had her feeling considerably creeped out. Since it was still relatively early in the afternoon, Claudia suggested they pack up and move camp, an idea which Becca thoroughly agreed with. So, over the next hour or so, the girls dismantled their tent, packed away their belongings, and carried on hiking down the trail in the direction of the next primitive campsite. At one point, the couple stopped to check their map to ensure they were headed in the right direction. They studied the map for a moment, then looked up from it to scan their surroundings. When suddenly, one of them spotted a man lurking on the trail behind them. It was the same man who had asked Becca for a cigarette back at the campground bathrooms. It made for a grim moment of realization for the couple. It wasn't just a chance encounter. They were being followed. Becca and Claudia immediately marched off down a trail they believed would lead them to the next primitive campground, picking up their pace in the hopes the man might lose track of them. The couple stopped on several other occasions as they progressed, looking over their shoulders to ensure they weren't continually being followed. Only when they failed to spot the gaunt-looking hermit did they feel safe enough to make camp again, and they did so at the next campground they came across. Once their campsite was set up, the couple prepared dinner, growing more comfortable with their surroundings as they ate. The woods around them seemed quiet and still. As more time went by, the more they became convinced that they were completely alone. It's at this point that Becca and Claudia began cuddling, watching the horizon turn from blue to orange as the sun dipped in the sky and began to set. It was rare that they had moments alone, and the couple relished every second of the peace and quiet the deep woods offered. There was just one problem. They were not alone. Creeping up to the campsite on cat's paws was the man who had asked Becca for a cigarette. He was an accomplished tracker, good enough that he was able to slip away from the couple entirely to retrieve something from the place he called home. You see, the man had a brick-and-mortar home, but he also spent a great deal of time living in a cave out in the woods. It was this cave he'd returned to in order to fetch a .22 caliber rifle he kept hidden away inside of it. The man kept the rifle close to his chest, watching the dancing flames of the girls' campfire from around 100 feet away. Then, as Claudia and Becca began to get intimate with one another, the man took the opportunity to creep closer. Staring intently as the girls began to kiss, he waited for the right moment. Right as they were about to retire to their tent for the evening, the man raised his rifle, took aim, and let out 8 shots in their direction. 5 bullets ripped through Claudia Brenner, breaking her arm, tearing apart her face, cracking her skull, and puncturing her neck. The remaining 3 rounds grazed Becca White's head, ripping through her back and puncturing her liver. After firing the shots, the man tore off through the woods in the opposite direction, whooping and laughing as he ran. Hunting his fellow humans was one of the most exhilarating thrills of his entire life, and to see his prey collapsing as his bullets tore through them was nothing short of intoxicating for him. The man believed that there was no way that either of the women could survive such a fusillade of gunfire, but he was wrong. Although Becca was in critical condition from being shot through the liver, she found that, despite her wounds, she was able to stand. With tears of terror in her eyes, she promised her pale and bloodied girlfriend that she'd go to fetch help, and then off she went, limping down the trail for 3 whole miles until she finally came to a main road. Claudia managed to flag down a passing driver who rushed her to the nearby Shippensburg police station to seek medical attention. Claudia described exactly where the attack had taken place before she was rushed to the hospital. Yet, despite arriving at the campgrounds as quickly as they could, the officers found that Becca had succumbed to her wounds. A heartbroken Claudia Brenner received word of her girlfriend's death. The police combed the crime scene for any evidence they could find. They quickly noticed that around 25 unfired .22 caliber bullets were lying on the ground, just less than 100 yards away from the campsite. They also found a knit cap, which they correctly assumed belonged to Becca's killer. One group of cops then searched the surrounding trails, while another took note of all the information that Claudia could offer them, including how she strongly suspected the man who'd followed them of being the attacker. A considerable effort was made to apprehend the gaunt, hermit-like man that had followed them down the trail, but over the week that followed, the police weren't able to locate anyone matching Claudia's detailed description. Meanwhile, a group of Old Order Mennonites who lived within just a few miles of the Michaud State Forest were visited by a man named Stephen Roy Carr, who expressed an interest in their community. Old Order Mennonites are similar to the Amish in the sense that they shun modern technology and refrain from involving themselves in modern society. Some communities even refuse to speak English among themselves and prefer to speak the German or Dutch of their religious ancestors. As you can imagine, the group doesn't exactly have people lining up to join them. So, when the solitary visitor told them that he wished to join their community, they welcomed him with only the slightest hint of suspicion. Yet, as it turned out, not everyone in this particular Mennonite community followed their faith as strictly as their brethren. In the attic of one household, there was a secret television that the homeowner would use to watch the nightly news. It was during one of these broadcasts that the Mennonite learned of a brutal murder that had taken place in the nearby Michaud Forest. When a picture of the case's main suspect was shown, the man instantly recognized him as the gaunt-faced stranger that had wandered into their community in the days prior under the pretense of needing to purchase some primitive farming equipment. The secret TV watcher headed into a nearby town, and the moment he arrived, he rushed to the local sheriff to report that none other than Stephen Roy Carr was sheltering himself among his people. A careful and very delicate operation was then planned, one that would keep the Mennonites' secrets under wraps while also ensuring that Carr would not receive any advanced warning of his imminent arrest. It involved the Mennonite returning to his village and inviting Carr to join him for dinner one evening. Then, just as Carr sat down to dinner with a family he believed had nothing but good intentions for him, the local police force swarmed their dwelling, capturing their suspect before putting him in cuffs. Even though the evidence against him was sparse to say the least, homicide detectives managed to convince Carr to waive his right to a jury trial in exchange for an agreement by the prosecution not to seek the death penalty. Yet, at his trial, Carr made the horrifically homophobic claim that he had been so enraged by the sight of two women making love that he had simply lost his mind and opened fire. He also tried to claim that Claudia and Becca had known he was watching and that their lovemaking was purely a method of taunting and provoking him. His defense attorney tried to link this to the fact that Carr had been violated in a Florida prison as well as having been abused as a child, and that the display of homosexuality had caused him to go temporarily insane. Thankfully, the judge refused to show any form of leniency against Carr, completely dismissing his claims as being homophobic nonsense and forcing the defense to accept the maximum penalty of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. In the aftermath of her ordeal, Claudia Brenner moved to Ithaca, New York, and went on to author a book which detailed the events of the shooting. She had since become an activist against anti-gay violence and is a vocal advocate of harsher sentences for those convicted of hate crimes against the LGBT community. Thankfully, public acceptance of gay and lesbian couples has skyrocketed since the mid-1980s, with local and national hate crime laws extending the sentences of those who seek to harm or persecute people who simply wish to freely express their love for their romantic partners. People like Stephen Carr must never be allowed to receive leniency by claiming that the free expression of love and affection offends or angers them, especially when two people seek the privacy and seclusion of a quiet campground to express that love. For a few summers back, when I was a kid, I used to go to a summer camp in Shenandoah National Park. This place is long gone now, which is a real shame because I have a lot of happy memories of spending a week in the woods up there with some of my friends. For the first few years before heading off to sleep, we did the stereotypical old campfire thing, telling stories, playing flashlight tag. But then this one year, the camp counselors had us playing this really weird game every so often. It was called Invisible. The idea was that you ran back to your cabin and either hid under the bunk beds or under your sleeping bag on the top bunk, whichever you were assigned. Then the counselors would inspect each cabin, and whichever had the most invisible kids got extra marshmallows or s'mores or whatever the after-dinner treat was that evening. I remember thinking it was a pretty weird game, and it definitely wasn't as fun as flashlight tag, but whatever it took to get extra marshmallows I was down for. We didn't play it so often that any of the kids complained, and it did get kind of fun once we all got the hang of it. I remember the best part being the race back to the cabins, and how I was one of the fastest kids there, so I always made it back to our cabin first. That obviously earned me a lot of praise from the camp counselors. We didn't find out why we were playing that game until years later, when we were old enough to recognize just how weird it really was. Basically, a prisoner had somehow managed to escape from the RSW Regional, which is the county jail over near Front Royal. Sheriff's deputies then figured out that the guy had made his way up into the park because a bunch of food kept going missing from all these campgrounds. It was obviously human theft, not just bears being bears. The really scary thing is the guy had been picked up for attempting to kidnap an elementary school girl after following her home from her bus stop. He did it in broad daylight, right in front of her chaperone. The guy just didn't seem to care. Looking back on it, we were obviously at risk, but the people I really feel for were the counselors. Hearing that news must have made them sick with fear, knowing that there was that kind of threat to us, just lurking out in the woods. Camp did actually end early that year for a lot of us. Kids' parents came to pick them up whenever they were able, so it's not like they just kept us there in spite of the risk. They just had to think of something to keep us safe while they organized getting all of us out of there. My dad said the way some of the counselors looked, it was obvious they hadn't slept in a couple of days. They must have been keeping watch at night in shifts, staying vigilant. This particular memory stands out to me because we didn't know anything bad was happening at the time. We were all just blissfully ignorant of how much danger we were in. And then when camp ended early, we were all just so bummed about it. But our parents couldn't exactly tell us why it had ended, because it no doubt would have traumatized us. I mean, knowing we were in such danger for a while and there was nothing we could do about it other than run and hide really makes you question what else was going on during our childhoods that was just a cover for something we were too young to handle.